بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome to another session here with Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasidin. Last time we were together talking about some of the devil's doors to the human heart. We discussed a few topics: anger, desire, being short-tempered, love of decoration in the house, clothing, furnishings, etc. We talked about cupidity, covetousness of other people, hastiness, and today we're going to talk about a few more topics, and then the author will move on from these abawab, or these doors, and we'll start to address how we can rectify our heart, rid ourselves of these shortcomings, and strengthen what he has called a fortress, the fortress of the heart. So from the avenues or the doors we are going to look at today, he says, min abawabihi hubbil mal, love of wealth. Wealth, not only money, but also possessions like homes and vehicles, clothing, today electronics and gadgets and gizmos, etc. To have love for these things, he says that when they settle in your heart, it spoils it and can lead you to seeking wealth through improper means. You fall in love with these things and are willing to do just about anything to get them. It causes a person to be stingy when they love money. They don't want to let it go. And it also causes them to fear poverty. And another result of that is they will withhold money when it's required to be paid, essentially denying others their rights, whether that is like zakat, or if it's responsibilities that you have towards family or friends or neighbors, or even your own community. If you have financial responsibilities, stinginess can prevent you from that. Love of money can prevent you from fulfilling those obligations. Essentially, Imam al-Ghazali, he says, to expound upon this, that everything beyond what you need for your daily expenses, for your basic provisions, this is the dwelling place of shaitan. Whatever is in abundance, this is where shaitan resides. Meaning, you need money, you need possessions, you need some wealth in order to live your life in a dignified manner, to be stable, to be a provider. But when it starts to become excessive, this is where shaitan, he is residing. When you have everything you need, your heart's empty. You're not worried. You're not thinking about more and more. He gives an example here. He says when someone, for example, finds $100 on the road, before they saw that $100, they weren't thinking about $100. But when they saw the $100, they started to think. And a lot of things came to, let's not say $100 today, let's say $1,000. What can you do with $100, right? Let's say you find $1,000 on the road. You start thinking about the potential of that $1,000. What am I going to do with this $1,000? I mean, I could tell you, I already have some thoughts. And then one thought leads to another. Well, if I had another $1,000 after that, then I could do X, Y, Z again. Or another thing that now I'm trying to figure out what I can utilize that $1,000 for. Before I saw the $1,000, it wasn't even in my mind. I already had what I needed. Iftar was booked, Sahur was booked, it was already paid for, things were good, everyone was happy, Eid clothes were bought, presents were done, everything's already sorted out. I'm not worried about it. Now, we've been introduced to something extra beyond what we need, and so we begin this process of thinking. And with each desire, I should say, when you find that $1,000, there are multiple desires that come up, and with each desire, there's another $1,000 behind it. Like I said, you probably thought of a couple of things you could do with $1,000. Each one of them requires $1,000 itself. I could do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I have to pick. Why would I need to pick when I could just go get $1,000 for each of those things? You start to think that now you actually have something. This $1,000 has enriched your life. You start to believe that your life has been now enriched, and it could be even more enriched if you had more to go with it. You start to think you actually need that. That's the thought that creeps into your mind. And so what happens is you build something, you purchase something. And when you build or purchase something, you end up having to purchase something in support of that. For example, you come across enough money to construct a home. I mean, this is, you're not going to find $375,000, $400,000 on the sidewalk, but, let's just say you worked to get to that point. Your dream castle, and you were excessive in doing it. You need a 2-bedroom. You thought, you know what? It would be great to have a 5-bedroom. What does that mean? You have 3 extra bedrooms. So what do you have to do for those 3 bedrooms? You got to fill them. You can't leave empty bedrooms. So what do you go and buy? Furniture that you don't need. And then what happens? You go, this is too big of a place to keep clean myself. I'm going to need to hire a maid. I got to get a maid. Right? So now that you've done this and you've bought the furniture, now you've got to buy something to help the furniture. And then the furniture goes out of date and goes out of style, and you've got to redo it, and you've got to update, etc., etc. And so now you are in this cycle because you've fallen in love with the worldly possessions. Each thing is leading to another thing. And Imam al-Ghazali, he says, and it continues to lead to another thing until the last thing that it leads to is you falling into the pits of hell. Waliyadu billah. He says there's no other conclusion than that. That's it. Note that the Prophet ﷺ, he says there's a lot. The Prophet ﷺ said a great deal about this topic, hubbul mal. But I'll leave you with one hadith found in Sunnah Tirmidhi. He says, ما ذئبان جائعان أرسل في غنم بأفسد لها من حرص المرء على المال والشرف لدينه. He says, 2 wolves set free among sheep are no more destructive to them than a man's desire for wealth and honor is to his religion. And a man's desire for wealth, meaning that your desire for wealth is more devastating than letting a sheep loose in a wolf loose in a flock of sheep. What's going to happen to those sheep? They're going to get eaten up. They're going to be destroyed. So this is a door that Shaitan uses to creep into your heart. The love of wealth. The next door, he says, Hamlul awam ala ta'assub bil madahib. And this is basically partisan bias and prejudice. Trying to get the laity, the masses, the general body of Muslims to fall into partisan bias and prejudice. And there's a number of levels to this that I think is important to bring up. Someone becomes devoted, a devoted partisan, and that's where you draw lines. We understand this in politics. One person's a Republican, the other person's a Democrat. They've created these alliances and allegiances with their party, and they end up disparaging the other and belittling and etc. You know the deal. Because you're not aligned with me, and that whole situation can happen in terms of your religious life as well. You can become partisan of sorts. And what's worse than that is when you align yourself with some group or someone and then you don't act according to their legacy. What does that mean? It's when you become devoted to someone or a group, a great companion, for example, and you're partaking in what's considered haram. You live and behave in a manner which is in direct opposition to the one that you've devoted yourself to, either a companion or a great imam. And if they were alive to see that, then they would consider you their enemy number one. Right? The true followers of the companions and the great imams, they strive to walk in their footsteps. And they don't use their allegiance as a divisive tool to hold other people in contempt for not standing with them. Just the label. Example would be, for example, having extreme partiality for Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. Being extremely partial, being a partisan for this great companion, while at the same time having nothing to do with him in terms of his legacy. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu was an ascetic. He was known as Zahid. He refrained and abstained from the worldly life, to the point that it was said while he was the Khalifa, he was the leader. He purchased a garment to wear for 3 dirhams, and then he cut the sleeves of it to shorten them. He could have purchased the best, the most expensive, had been, but this was his way. And then that person that's aligned with them and has created this allegiance and this partisanship, this partiality, you find them wearing silk clothes. Haram for men. You find them wearing silk clothes, which they purchased through impermissible means, improper channels. And then they're quarreling with others about their love for Ali. Who loves Ali more? Well, you have nothing to do with Ali ibn Abi Talib. You have nothing to actually do with this great companion of the Prophet ﷺ. It's very similar to someone claiming affinity to one of the 4 madhabs, one of the 4 imams, for example, Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, or Imam Ahmed. Claiming an affinity to them, and you only pretend to be their followers and do not live in accordance to their teachings. Similar to that example of Ali ibn Abi Talib. If the imam were alive, they would consider that person an opponent on the day of resurrection, and they would say to them, my way is a way of action, to do, and all you're doing is talking. It says any talking should result in action and not simply ranting and raving. That was the way of the imams. The imams and their madhab was one of action. It was determining the legal code of Islam so that it can be lived by. Answers can be provided for questions of the congregation so that they could live in accordance to that legal code, as opposed to ranting and raving and diving into philosophical debate, which only ends in frustration and enmity, animosity between these particular groups. That was never the intent. So when it's used as such a divisive tool, it is in direct opposition to their legacy. So they'll say, why did you abandon my practice? That by which I met Allah. We can't think for a minute that these great imams, they sat down and just theorized, philosophized the Islamic tradition as an exercise to be academic. They were there trying to research and master the law so that they could be guided and they could live by a way, a code. So they would say, why did you abandon my practice and pretend to be loyal to me? There's another aspect to this, adhering to a particular legal school. Like a person that learns Islam and learns the legal code through a particular madhab, a school. And if you've been around here, you know that's one of the ways that we teach here. It's one of the traditional ways of learning, is to pick a legal school and learn that legal school's theory and their outlook and their rulings. But a person does this not to have practical knowledge, but to gain followers and status. to belong to a group in a way, so that you have a status of sorts with people. And this is really the only way they were able to achieve such an aspiration. They couldn't find any other avenue than to almost like to say, I'm unique. My status is special. And they do this through such sectarian and partisan prejudice. And they can utilize that as a tool against others. Well, my madhab is this and yours is that, etc., etc. So this is one of the avenues that Shaitan uses to penetrate into the heart of the faithful, using sectarian and partisan prejudice. The next issue, he says, وَمِنْ أَبْوَابِهِ, he says, حَمْلُ الْعَوَامِ عَلَى التَّفْكِيرِ فِي ذَاتِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَصِفَاتِهِ فِي أُمُورٍ لَا تَبْلُغُهَا عُقُولُهُم. Basically saying that, trying to push the laity to think about Allah, his that, we should say like his essence of sorts, or his sifat. Trying to push them into thinking about these theological issues when they're not trained in the field. Their intellect hasn't been trained to comprehend these topics. حتى يشككهم بأصل الدين. Basically, until you push them to become doubtful in the very foundations of their faith. So when you dive into theological issues and you're untrained, it can lead to not only doubt, but disbelief and innovation. And the trick here that Shaitan uses against the novice is that he will make them believe that they have the intellectual capacity to indulge in such an exercise, especially if they're educated in other fields. You know, you have a PhD in something, or you're a doctor of something. It's not this field. It's like any other highly specialized field trying to dive into the depths of another. You are getting yourself into quite a sticky situation. So what happens here in this situation is that they begin to pursue ambiguous things. They begin to assume that they have great insight by doing so, by going through this exercise. And basically, they're doing nothing but filling their heart with doubts. Imam al-Ghazali says, the most foolish of men are those who believe strongly in their own intelligence, while the truly intelligent are the most suspicious of themselves and ready to ask those who know more. Think about this. Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says that Shaitan will come to you and he will say to you, who created you? And you will say, what? What will you say? Who created you? Allah. And then Shaitan will turn to you and he will say, who created Allah? And some will be safe from this by saying, Amantu billah wa rasulihi. And this was the prescription that the Prophet ﷺ gave to the general congregant, the general laity of Muslims. That when these types of doubts or these philosophical arguments or questions, they come up, you don't need to dive into them. You don't need to respond to them. All you need to do is say, Amantu billah wa bi rasulihi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I believe in Allah and I believe in His Messenger. And you leave these things, these issues, you leave them to those that have been trained in the field and that have been blessed with knowledge and guidance. You keep it at the basics. And that's where it needs to be. This is one of the tricks of Shaitan. The Prophet ﷺ in this hadith, notice that he did not order us to figure out a solution for this or go looking for an answer to this type of wiswas, these whispers here. This is something that should be left alone by those that are untrained in the field. And the scholars, they are those that have insight and knowledge to be able to answer such questions and deal with such topics. Otherwise, a person may say something about Allah that will end up devastating their religion. It will end up pushing them into disbelief. And they don't even realize it. They don't even recognize it. And then they're saying things that are tantamount to kufr, or just blatant kufr. It's like Imam al-Ghazali, he says, like someone who gets on a boat, rides out into the ocean, and has no idea how to swim. If the boat falls from under you, what's going to happen? Quite obvious, right? The next thing he says here is to have evil thoughts and assumptions about Muslims. This is another one of the tricks of shaitan. Is to have evil assumptions of Muslims and passing judgment upon them based on those evil assumptions. You end up degrading and despising them. And then because of that, your tongue is let loose on them, backbiting and slandering them, etc. You start to see yourself as better than them based on assumptions. Based on assumption. And the level of assumption, I should say the severity of the assumption, is an indication of the severity of the sin that it will get you into. Rather, the person of faith, they should seek excuses for others. The person of faith, they seek excuses for people, whereas the hypocrite, they look for their faults and their flaws, trying to expose them. Think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words. He says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu ijtanibu kathiran min al-dhann inna ba'da al-dhanni ithm. O you who believe, avoid much suspicion, for some of suspicion is sinful. Avoid suspicion. We are commanded as Muslims to have good assumptions. If we're going to make assumptions of people, we have positive assumptions of people, and we try and understand scenarios and circumstances based on the best case and not the worst case. You see somebody doing something that looks questionable, the initial immediate response should be a positive view. And not something negative, jumping to negative conclusions, and that would lead a person into sin. By being positive, while it might not be true, thinking positive about somebody, even though if the reality is very different, thinking positively of them will not lead you to sin. Even if it's wrong, it won't lead you into sin. You won't look down on them, you won't backbite them, there's no reason to talk about them, there's no reason to look, make yourself feel any better than them. And you'll walk away a winner. Shaitan will have been repelled. So it's important that not only do you try and have good assumptions of people, as Muslims, it's also important that we don't put ourselves in compromised positions where we can be subject to negative assumption. We don't want to make ourselves open to that. Because essentially what happens is not only are we going to potentially compromise our own reputation, but we will assist people in thinking negatively. The car broke down, I need to use the phone. There's a liquor store right there. I could go in and I could get the phone and ask, can I call the tow truck from the liquor store? Now I could come out and somebody from my community might see me and assume like, well, what is he doing in the liquor store? Oh no. Brother Imam's going to the liquor store. Or I could say, you know what? I'm not even going to put myself in that situation. I mean, people should assume the best of me, and I could get all haughty about it and you know, a little bit, it's not real, it's not addressing reality, or I'll have to walk down a little bit and go into the next place that wouldn't put me in that position. That's key. And you note that this was the way of the Prophet ﷺ. It's very well known. At one point in his life, he had multiple wives, and he had just recently married one of his wives, Sophia. He was spending some time in the masjid, and she came to visit him, and it was nighttime, and she was going to go back to her house, and the Prophet ﷺ wanted to escort her back home. This is right after they had been married. And so he took her, and he was walking her home. It was dark. And while he was walking her to the home, some of the companions, they saw him walking with a woman. They had not known, that this was the marriage. And so they backed away and tried to give him space. And so the Prophet ﷺ immediately told them to come, and he wanted to address the situation right away. He said, "This is Sophia bint Huyay, basically this is my wife." And they said, "Well, we weren't thinking anything of it." And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Look, Shaitan, he runs through you like blood runs through your veins." Meaning, you may be susceptible to suspicion, suspecting your Prophet of illicit relations here, having this out at night with a woman. And that's another great example. And I think that's extremely important and very relevant to our day and age. And this is something very practical for people that work in mixed environments. So you don't put yourself in a situation where that can be questioned. You're in an office, you have to have a meeting. It happens to be a female that you have to meet with. How are you going to manage that meeting? Leave the door open, close the door, go out to lunch. There are many scenarios that you have to navigate in this situation, but I'm telling you, and many of us are seeing this now, that not only is it going to be your dignity and honor, it could be your career that you lose in the process, even if you're innocent, because you put yourself in a situation where it's very possible, and it has happened, and it seems to continue to happen, where people take advantage of that particular situation. And I think that's a practical example of how that can play out. It can play out in a very negative way. So that's a couple of things there. Just to wrap up, those are the major doors, the devil's doors to the human heart. Those are the major ones that Imam al-Ghazali mentioned. He does have a couple of other ones that he mentioned. So this is our condensed, summarized version. So what we're going to do after this is talk a little bit more about the state of the heart, and then we'll start looking at some of the cures for these weaknesses, how to fortify ourselves from the snares of Shaitan bi'idhnihi ta'ala. And that's where I'll leave you. Jazakallah khair. I appreciate your attendance and attentive listening. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.